she was later able to move to the United States and has been leading the cause for the Uyghurs ever since. But her family and her is still in captivity in China. Today, her story is shared by many more. The attacks on the Uyghurs in China has increased, especially during the last 2 years. We currently know that the conservative estimate is, we talk about 1 million people in forced internment camps. Some people talk about 2 million people. We don't know the numbers. We see satellite images of camps being built. We hear from Uyghurs around the world that they have not heard from their families for the last year. We also know that Xinjiang, the province in northwest China, is becoming a testing ground for whatever surveillance technology there is in the world. And we know that this happens at a time when China is taking an even more authoritarian direction under Xi Jinping, and also is having a more ambitious approach in also influencing the world with regards to human rights issues. That's also why we find it so important to have this event tonight and shed light on what is happening in Xinjiang, what is happening to the Uyghurs, and how is the world reacting. And it is particularly important for us to have this here in Oslo, in Norway, as it is one of the countries where we have become very silent on issues that involve China. And we hope that this event can be part of also helping to break that silence. We're very happy that the session tonight, we have some very distinguished speakers here, among them Dolkun Isa, who has taken over as the leader of the World Uighur Congress after Rabi Kadir. And we have the panel tonight is being chaired by Kristoffer Rønneberg from Aftenposten, who's been both a foreign correspondent for Aftenposten in the US, but also in China, and is one of the leading journalists in Norway covering issues to do with both Norway-China relations and also developments in China. So I'm very glad to have Kristoffer here. I'm very glad to see all of you here. And I would give the floor to you and introduce the rest of our very distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to see so many people here despite the horrendous conditions we have outside. The first time I visited Xinjiang was in 1998, and I thought I'd lost my wife. We'd been traveling from Pakistan, we'd followed the Karakoram highway, and we were supposed to take a bus from Tashkurgan and up to Kashgar. And by sheer lack of luck, we ended up on 2 different buses, and hers arrived about 6-7 hours before mine. So she was stuck in Kashgar wondering what happened to me, and I was on the bus hoping that she had made it to Kashgar. Fortunately, she found her way, I found my way, we met up in Kashgar, and she's here tonight. So I've been to Xinjiang 3 times, in '98, in 2001, and in 2006. And I wanted to show you some pictures. Unfortunately, my computer didn't seem to want me to show them to you, but they're on my Facebook page if you want to see them. The reason why I wanted to show them to you is because they show a part of Xinjiang that we don't hear about in the news today. It's especially Kashgar made a very, very deep impression on me. The fantastic culture, the food, the kindness of everyone we met, all the smiles, everyone who came up and wanted to know more about the world I came from, and they were happy to share the world in which they lived. And that's unfortunately a thing from the past. The Kashgar that we visited in '98 and then up until 2006 doesn't exist anymore. It's been taken over, and now it's under a regime that's very hostile to the local community. So if you can talk about a cultural capital of the Uyghurs, I'm not sure if it's in Kashgar anymore. It might be outside of the country. We will discuss all of this tonight, and it's such a tremendous pleasure to have this panel here with these experts. You couldn't ask for a better panel anywhere in the world, I promise you this. And we're not going to do any lectures before we do the panel, so I'd like to ask all three of you to come up and take your seats, please. We have Dolkun Isa, who was already introduced, the head of the World Uighur Congress. Here we have Megha Rajagopalan, who was the journalist in China who really broke this story and told it to the West. And she has And finally, we have what I assume will be a familiar face to most of, if not all of you here, Harald Bøckman, who is by far the most scholarly and knowledgeable China expert we have in Norway. With that, I'll take a seat. So I figured as an introduction, we could let the journalist take the word first, and if you can tell us how you came across this story, because you've traveled to Xinjiang many times, Megha, and you've seen the development over the course of the last decade. And when did you hear about the internment camps for the first time, and what did you meet when you came to Xinjiang?
Yeah, it's a good question. Can everyone hear me? Well, first of all, thank you all so much for being here. So my history is, I first came to China as a student around the Olympics time, so 2008, 2009, and I think like you, I had sort of very similar experience. I backpacked through when I was a student and sort of hitchhiked the Karakoram Highway, and I was just like really stunned by, just the culture of the place, how different it is from other parts of China, how distinctive the culture is. The street life in places like Kashgar, and how warm and welcoming the people were, all that sort of stuff. And I went on to work as a reporter for Reuters from 2012 to 2016, and in that capacity I covered sort of a lot of the developments around Uyghurs in China that took place around that time. So I think after I moved to BuzzFeed in 2016, I sort of, I found myself in a job where I had the ability to do things at kind of a deeper level, write a little bit longer and on more complex subjects, and I knew I wanted to write about the Uyghur issue because I felt it was sort of not very well understood, in the West. And I think very quickly after sort of in early 2017, a lot of us in the foreign correspondent community started hearing that things in Xinjiang were starting to get really bad, just getting a lot worse very quickly. There started to be stories of reporters would take trips and then their driver would tell them that they were being sent to a re-education camp for having worked with the reporters. There started to be a lot more stories of people just disappearing in the middle of the night. And, in China, these things have happened for a long time, but it seemed to me that the sort of scale of this was becoming something different. And, I just had this thought, there aren't, being a journalist in this day and age is, it tends to be a situation where you're pretty limited in terms of your resources, and certainly in China, there aren't quite as many foreign journalists as there once were because of the way that the media business is. So I thought, if we don't go and investigate this, that it's quite possible that nobody will ever find out what's really happening there. So I think I didn't start by thinking, oh, I want to write about these internment camps, because I think at that time nobody knew that they would become sort of such a big part of the story. Certainly I had no suspicion that upwards of 1 million people would end up being interned in these camps, within the course of a year. we didn't really know what to think. So I sort of thought, I'm going to try to find one of these camps. I ended up trying to, I went to Istanbul to talk to a bunch of folks in the Uyghur exile community who had sort of left very recently, especially people from Kashgar. You know, a lot of those people, even though they were still sort of reluctant to speak to journalists because they had family that they were concerned about that were living within Xinjiang, they wanted to make known, you know, the kind of intensity of the situation and how much worse it had gotten. And because many of these people had left quite recently, they had a memory of sort of where these camps were, what they looked like, what if they had relatives who had gone to these camps, they sort of knew what was happening inside to some extent. So through that, I met somebody who sort of remembered the location of one of the camps in Kashgar, and sort of we worked together to sort of find the GPS coordinates of this place. And then after that, I went back to Kashgar and then found the camp, which I'll just describe it quickly. It was sort of in a very nondescript neighborhood in the northern part of the city. You know, there were like sort of tea houses and little stores in this beautiful little tree-lined street. And it used to be a school. It used to be a place where people would, I think it was a science and technology school actually, but as soon as you came up on it, it's like this huge compound that was surrounded with brick. There were loops of barbed wires on the top, and papered across this compound were propaganda posters in Chinese language. I think one of them had a giant cartoon picture of an eye, and the iris of the eye was the Chinese flag, and in Chinese the caption said, "Cherish ethnic unity as you cherish your own eyes," which I can't imagine anything more dystopian than that. And I tried to take a picture, and there was a police officer outside of the walls who asked me to delete it, and which I did not do. But I think that was sort of my first encounter, and since then, of course, many other people have documented, you know, dozens and dozens of more like that.
But you understood right there and then that this was a big global story.
Yeah, I mean, I think between that and sort of, you know, I think everybody around the world right now is really focused on what mass surveillance means, especially, you know, especially in Europe. And I think the reason I thought it would become a global story is because it was like what's happening in Xinjiang is such an, you know, aside from all of the issues around internment, which, you know, understandably are the most urgent and the sort of the focus of the story, there is a separate issue about surveillance that I think, you know, Xinjiang is sort of the most extreme example maybe in the world of kind of high technology being used to, you know, control people in that way. And I think that's a big part of why it's become a global story. It's a big part of why people connected to my reporting before it was a global story. So yeah.
Dolkun Isa, we hear all these different numbers for how many people might be in the camps. What is the estimate that you work with? How many people do you think are stowed away in these camps?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank to organize such a nice event by Raftostiftelsen Foundation and Norsk Uighurkomiteen. I really appreciate. Before I answer the question, I would like to, can I say a couple of sentences? And today is actually tomorrow is 22nd anniversary of one of the massacre which was happening in Øst-Turkestan, 1997. 1997, 5th February in Volja area in Øst-Turkestan. Peaceful demonstration by the Uyghur youth and crackdown by the Chinese police. And according to the Amnesty International report, more than 100 people were killed, and more than 400 people injured, and hundreds of thousands of people disappeared. It was happened in 1997. Tomorrow is exactly 20 years of anniversary. World Uighur Congress called all the Uyghur community, Uyghur organizations around the world to hold a protest stage in front of the Chinese consulate, Chinese embassy, and organize commemorate event. Actually, we did since the 22 years. Tomorrow, as I know, more than 20 cities, 16 countries, we hold such a protest around the world. So it is 22 years already passed, but situation is never has been better. So situation today is more worse than it has ever in my lifetime. If I come back to the question, it is very difficult to confirm how many people and how many Uyghurs and Kazakhs, some other nationality in the camp. But estimate number, beginning of 2018, definitely around 1 million. But since then, already 1 year passed, we heard every day Chinese government expanded, and because of the satellite image, some international expert analyze and show us this camp is already expanded 5-6 times larger than last year. So some international NGOs and some research center saying 2 million, some is 1 million, some is 3 million, but we believe as up to 3 million people and in this concentration camp.
And it seems like every Uyghur outside of the region has someone in their family or someone they know who has disappeared.
Yes, it is true. It is definitely that. Like I can say, there is also a lot of my countrymen sitting here, and most of them who are sitting here have lost contact family members. I personally also have lost contact my family member more than 22 months, 21 months. Last communication I had with my family in middle of April 2017. Since then, I have no any communication with my family, and all the Uyghur who living in Norway, European Union, United States, around the world, Turkey, they have lost the communication with the family. This is definitely, and all the Uyghur family who is living in exile and family is the first targeting groups or by the Chinese government is their family member in the camp. Yes.
So all three of us, the others here on stage, we've all been to the region and we've experienced the culture and the people there before this last round or before the camps were set up. You know more about the situation now. What does this do to the culture, to the Uyghur culture? What is Kashgar like today?
Well, I left my country 26 years ago. When I was left the Øst-Turkestan, Kashgar is a very beautiful city. If you go to the Kashgar, you really enjoying the Uyghur culture. But Chinese government start 2008 and 2009 so-called horse reform, then destroy and 75% Kashgar, all the heritage, cultural heritage. 2018, Chinese government started and implemented whole year 2009. Then we did some international campaign to stop the destroying cultural heritage, because Kashgar is, you already visit, you know very well, and more than 2,000 years history, and center of the Silk Road. So that's why we call international community, European Union, European Parliament, and around the world, Chinese government has to stop this destroyed cultural heritage. And but it was too late. 2012, European Parliament passed the original resolution to call Chinese government stop destroy the Kashgar cultural heritage. But that time already 75–80% cultural heritage was destroyed already. But today, and a lot of foreign journalists visiting, they are coming back. Some German journalists also visit last year. After he came back, and he or she explain us, this saying is, you cannot compare between 25–26 years ago. Even you cannot compare 3–4 years ago in the Kashgar. Kashgar, very energetic city. You can see and from 7 to 70 years, all the young guy, middle age and teenagers, people very energetic. It's a business center of Øst-Turkestan. But the people saying today is whole street is empty. Nearly you cannot see the people from between 18 to 45 years old. You can see very old people and some women and children on the street. There are also you can see very less. And the Kashgar also a lot of mosque. And you can see mosque and the religion is also one of the most important identity of the Uyghur identity, religious. Eidka, for example. But today Eidka Mosque is closed. Just a museum. Not only Eidka, today most of the mosque is already closed. 2016, from 2016 October to 2017, within several months, Chinese government destroyed 3,000 until 5,000 mosques. So we trying to explain the situation, the whole world, particularly Muslim world, but no reaction. And the Chinese government, step by step, and they destroyed cultural heritage in the Kashgar, some other hotel, some other city. And today, you cannot see really Uyghur cultural sign in the Kashgar. Even today, Uyghur restaurant decorated to Uyghur culture, that restaurant also destroyed. One of the biggest Uyghur restaurant in the Uighurene, what's it called? In the Uighurene, one of the biggest Uyghur restaurant. This decorate really Uyghur culture, but arrested all the employer and closed this restaurant as well because of the decorated Uyghur culture, Uyghur sign. So today, the Kashgar, the Chinese government really doing cultural assimilation policy towards the Uyghurs, and they destroy Uyghur language, Uyghur culture, and religious as well. And actually, Chinese government's policy, one policy has never changed. It is the assimilation policy. 1949, Chinese Communist Army occupied Øst-Turkestan, then immediately implemented its population transfer this area. And sometimes Chinese government this policy, assimilation policy, and implement very hardly, sometimes a little bit normal. But since Xi Jinping took the power, Xi Jinping and Qin Shengou, they are really launched hard strike campaign and destroy really. And today the Uyghur identity really face dangerous situation. Chinese, we can say Chinese government really implemented cultural genocide and trying to eliminate it, whole Uyghur identity.
If we take the other side of that, Harald, you have such great knowledge about China and how the Chinese leaders think. Why is Xinjiang such an important region for Beijing to control, and why are they using these methods to try to overrun the existing culture that's been there for so long?
Well, this is different. Oh,
if I don't
okay, sorry.
We'll get back.
So, do I remember your question? Was it why are they so keen on ruining what's going on in Xinjiang?
Yeah, we hear about signification.
I think it has to do with the so-called Belt and Road. That's one part, but I think that perhaps we could bring that up later on. Sure. Because the way I see it, it's a sign of the failure of the Chinese policy towards the minorities. Like Dolkun Isa said, it has been a process of assimilation to larger or smaller degree. They don't call it assimilation, but the end result is that. And I think what we see today, and what's significant today, is that there's a whole new dimensions about the measures that the Chinese are implementing. And the way I see it is that they are enforcing many of the ways of disciplining their own population and test that on the Uyghurs and the other nationalities. So Xinjiang is a testing ground, is a laboratory, which I think is quite worrying, because this can also in the long run be used against the people in China.
a form of brainwashing.
Brainwashing, but there are various ways. I mean, the point is, the Chinese think that what works with the Chinese, it works with the Tibetans or Uyghurs or Mongols or whoever, and that's completely wrong, because this is certainly a cultural condition. The tradition of various types of incarceration or detention, it's based on the assumption that it's possible to transform the people, that people are malleable, they can be changed in their thinking. And it has taken the hard way, which was called reform through labor, which they have gradually phased out the most, the hardest one. That was actually one form of prison. And today what you see they're trying to use is what they call re-education through labor. And that's harsh enough, including all kinds of on the people as such. So I think we should start talking about genocide, because you have a clear definition of genocide in the Convention from 1948. And part of what's happening now,
Like concentration camps also be applicable to these types of
no,
camps?
I think concentration camps, at least for us Europeans, it gives the notion of the Germans, and that was for extermination purposes. This is different. The Chinese want to educate the Uyghurs by coercion to become good Chinese citizens. Start eating, pork. Now we're into the year of the pig, aren't we? So I'm sure there's more pressure on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang these days. So I think we should be a little careful about our terminology, because it's not to kill as many as possible, but it's to transform as many as possible. But of course comes as with a cost, because people are also dying because of the treatment.
Megha, you wrote a story, I think it was last summer, about the families that the Uyghur communities outside of China, and how they are being pressured by the Chinese government as well.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that, and because that tells us something about the extent of this project, that it's going far beyond the Chinese borders. I mean, there are Uyghurs in Norway, I know this, who are also feeling the pressure.
Yeah.
Not to talk too loudly about it, and not to stay in touch with the relatives.
Yeah. So I'll sort of explain some of the broader context of this as well. So I think it's interesting. Until about last summer, the Chinese state media and kind of any media within the PRC that is related to the state was basically absolutely silent about this issue. You just really wouldn't read anything about the camps really at all. And then in August that changed when the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination surprised everybody, and during kind of a routine review made some very, very strong statements, raised this number upwards of 1 million people being held in these camps. And because of the kind of level of authority that body has, that attracted a whole lot of press coverage kind of around the world. And since then, the Chinese state media as well as government authorities have sort of launched into this sort of full-throated propaganda campaign. The first reaction was to say, well, this isn't actually happening, you guys are just making it up. And then it became, well, it sort of is happening, but it's actually a social good. We're educating these people, and they should be happy that we're educating them, and that sort of thing. So I guess the reason I bring that up is that it tells you that the Chinese government cares intensely what we all who are living outside of China think about this, what we all hold to be true, to be factual, and all that stuff. And I think a big part of that campaign has been this kind of systematic effort to terrorize exiles. And that's not necessarily limited to the Uyghur community. Certainly Han Chinese that are in the human rights community, Tibetans, have been going through this for decades, Uyghurs as well, far preceding this campaign, this internment campaign have been facing harassment. So it's not necessarily a new issue, but what's new now are two things. You know, one is the kind of the level of technology. So it's the ability of these kind of agents that are harassing Uyghurs who live outside the country to contact them by their cell phones, to to threaten them over things like WeChat and other social messaging applications, and to sort of surveil them through things like Facebook photos and things like that. And the second thing is that the stakes are now much higher. So, you know, if you can now say to somebody, if you don't cooperate with me, if you don't inform on your community, then your son or your mother is going to be sent to a re-education camp. You know, it makes it very, very difficult for you to refuse. And so the story that I worked on last summer, actually, I spent a lot of time, sort of talking to and focusing on a young father who lives in Sweden. He lives in the south of Sweden, and he was put in this kind of untenable situation. Basically, he and his teenage son had left Xinjiang sort of right before this camps thing sort of became as big as it currently is. They didn't really know that this was going to happen. They were living in Turkey, and his son was going to high school, and he was working in a restaurant there. And it came to be one summer, his son, I think, had off school and wanted to go and see his grandparents, and so sort of unthinkingly, he bought a flight back, went back to Xinjiang, and promptly just disappeared. And basically, I think to his knowledge, like, the son is sort of incommunicado, but still alive and within Xinjiang. But basically, what happened after that is the father, he went to Sweden, is now pursuing refugee status there, and despite being in Sweden, being in a Western country, a liberal democracy, a country that's been very critical of Chinese human rights abuses, has even prosecuted people in the past for harassing exiles and trying to get them to inform. He's left in this position where he has no protection. He was being called by security agents in China saying, we'll send your son away to a camp, you'll never see him again unless you cooperate, unless you inform. And I was just really blown away by how this impacted him, like his psychology. He was just, tortured. He felt that he had sold out his people, but he felt that he couldn't do anything about it, because, I mean, anybody faced with that prospect for their child is going to, think about protecting their child first. And the thing is, there are just thousands and thousands of people that are in positions like this all over the world, in places like Norway, where we would never expect that an authoritarian government would leverage that kind of sway over people who are permanent residents or citizens. It's happening everywhere, and I think it's an indication that this is not just something that's happening within the boundaries of China. It's happening, far beyond that, and it's something that impacts on all of us, on our institutions and on democracies that we care about.
Dolkun Isa, if we sort of stay with the international perspective here, we've seen human rights organizations, including today in Geneva, calling for UN bodies and for national governments to react to. I mean, this is the biggest mass internment of people since, I guess, the Second World War. But yet the international outcry seems to be lacking. We see some things happening in the US Congress, for example. Senator Rubio has proposed using the Magnitsky laws to punish some of the lawmakers or some of the government officials in Xinjiang. But when you work with international communities trying to put pressure on governments to respond to this, what kind of reactions do you face? How easy is it to get attention?
Well, actually, and until August, and the UN Third Committee reviewed Chinese report. Until that time, the World Uighur Congress and the Uighur organization, Uighur activists, doing a lot of job and trying to explain the situation and really takes international attention, but very less international attention until August, and some international, very few international media reported it, but really no UN level or European level or some countries level. Most of the time they are very silent. But after August 3rd committee review Chinese report, Chinese government denied everything. We don't have exist such camps. Actually, and the UN expert studies since the several months and well preparation and reported everything. But Chinese government was not cooperative with the UN expert, saying it's completely denied everything. Then, and this issue becomes international issue, a lot of international media attention, and since then also Uyghur community around the world and made testimony, because as we said, all the Uyghurs who live in exile, lost a parent, disappearance, and even died in the camp. Even my mother also was passed away in the camps last year. So this is such a situation was happening. Then also your community and then they trying to speak out and they made testimony. Then in the November 6th, UPR on China was happening in Geneva, United Nations review, Chinese periodic review. Then since then, no, this case really and one of the main things international media and several countries and the United Nations were really involved in concerning this issue. Since then, as you say, U.S. Congressman Marco Rubio, some other congressmen also held several testimony on this, and also now the two bill was introduced to the Congress now and on the process, and the UK Parliament also just last week held a UK Parliament discussion, German Parliament.
And one question that many have asked in recent months is that there seems to be there's no big solidarity movement in other Muslim countries. Why do you think they haven't made this a big issue?
Yeah, it is the big issue. This is the big challenge, no? And as I said, United Nations, European Parliament, and some Western country really involved in and concerning this issue. During the UPR, 14 countries in the rise this issue and asking the Chinese government close down this camp, but not single Muslim country, unfortunately, and and rise this issue. It is a big problem. It is a shameful problem, 21st century, because today, because we are Muslim, and the religious persecution is one of the big problem today. That's why we are trying to contact the Muslim country, Muslim society, but most of the Muslim country until still silent. Only Malaysia, only the Muslim country speak out until now. But recently, some Muslim society in Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Bengal, civil society really speak up in Turkey and organize demonstration and they speak out and they make some pressure to the government to speak loudly. But we will see, and upcoming Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council will start at the end of this month. And today, as you see in the Geneva and the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, World Uighur Congress, International Service for Human Rights, they hold a press conference. And we ask, we are asking the United Nations Human Rights Council adopt a resolution to send investigation to the region. But how many Muslim countries will support this resolution, we will see in the future. Now it's too early to say something. Yes.
Harald, we've seen that also countries like Norway are very careful in their criticism of China. There was a sentence, I think, in the Universal Periodic Review last year that was, we are concerned about the situation or something like that. Is it just because of money, or why is this not a bigger? Why is there not bigger international outcry?
Well, Norway's one case, and I think it's kind of scandalous how low and how totally uncritical the government is. Before, maybe not some of you are not aware, but officially Norway would like to call themselves what was that, a big power, big humanitarian power or something?
Punching above our weight, something like that.
As you know, because we're so small, so we had to find something, a way to be big. But I think now that we're as small as we ever were, because there has hardly been any. I read the Norwegian statement in the Geneva roundup, and that was. I mean, it was just. The Chinese will look at it and just laugh. Doesn't mean anything. So, and the situation is difficult because you have the UN system, you have the NGO system, but on the state level you have very little reaction. I guess Merkel in Germany has been the most clearly spoken on this. So one has, if one wants to do something more in order to support the people in Xinjiang, then one has to think of smart ways of doing things, because Norway is never going to sell, to let down their salmons, and dump them in the ocean if they can't sell it to China. But you have one thing that would hurt the Chinese would be the more focus on the Belt and Road. And I mean, it's not the belt, but it's the belt that goes through Xinjiang, and the road goes through the ocean somehow. And that is part of the reason why they are harnessing a whole population there, because they want to have free passage of their commodities through Eurasia. And unfortunately, most of the countries in Central Asia are also complying, sitting quietly. So, that could be one point that would hurt. Norway has joined one of these huge investment banks that the Chinese established some 3-4 years ago. If you withdraw from that, that would also raise some issue. There's also the question of cultural boycott, which is more difficult, I would think, and I don't know if I'm in favor of it. But there has been raised the question of academic boycott, because so many academics and cultural people in I think the last list was 350 something named people, including the rector of the Xinjiang University, who has been condemned to death. So that's also an issue that one should look into at least. So it's not an easy way out, but it's worth trying.
I figured we could open up for questions in a couple of minutes. So if you want to think about questions you have for the panel, then please do so. I just wanted to ask you, Megha. I mean, all four of us on stage have had our visa troubles with China, and your term as a correspondent in China ended last year. I know you can't go into detail about that, but can you talk about your experience working as a journalist on these very sensitive issues? How easy was it to get access, to get people to talk? What reactions did you face when you went there?
Yeah, so I arrived in China to work as a journalist kind of on the eve of Xi Jinping taking office, and so I don't really have such a basis to compare it with the earlier Hu Jintao era. Thank you. But even in my time there, this issue of access has gotten just dramatically worse. And it really does impact the coverage. I think it impacts the both journalists' ability to work, and then by extension, the world's understanding of China and sort of all of its depth. And that issue is sort of compounded in places like Xinjiang and Tibet and other parts of the country that the government considers to be sensitive. So just to give you an idea, so if you're an accredited journalist in China, you have a journalist visa and your passport. So it's not, you can't really hide what you do if somebody asks you for your ID. So all over Xinjiang now there's there's lots of checkpoints kind of on the highway, and there's of course, like when you check into a hotel, you have to give your passport. So there's sort of lots of points along the way where your identity as a journalist might become known to authorities. So as a result of that, I can't think of a single exception to this. I think every foreign journalist who has visited Xinjiang to report on it has been detained at some point, has been questioned by police. I kind of got off easy, I have to say, because, I mean, I don't know why, but I think I appear a little bit less threatening than maybe somebody with a big camera, and so that's probably why. But I think a lot of my colleagues have sort of been followed around for the duration of their trip. One of my colleagues who works for the Globe and Mail in Canada, he took a driving trip in the country, was followed by like a convoy of like, I think he said like 9 cars or like nine police officers for just like hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. There are people whose assistants, news assistants have been threatened, their families have been threatened. People who have been detained. Jerry Shi, who's now at the Washington Post, was held like overnight in a police station in rural Xinjiang, like sort of not allowed to sleep. If you think about all this stuff, like there's sort of the primary impact, which is to intimidate the journalist. But there's also kind of secondary impacts that we don't think about. So for instance, like news organizations now, if you're going to take a trip to Xinjiang, it's quite an expensive flight actually from Beijing. So if you're already posted there, you have to justify to your boss, like, this is a really important story. But then when you get there, if you're followed around the entire time by police, how are you going to talk to people? How are you going to produce something that's worth telling? So then the end result is that your boss says, well, this isn't going to be a productive trip, so why don't you report on something somewhere else in the country? This is a big country with lots of stories. So the result of that is, we have this very dire human rights crisis right now. And, I think maybe until recently, until it became a really big story, there were, all of the incentives were just for reporters to sort of, to not take the trip and not spend the resources and the time to really dig into it. And I think that's maybe part of the reason that it took so long for it to become, a big global news story. And I think, unfortunately, these issues around harassment have definitely become worse. For me personally, even before I lost my visa, like, after the first story I wrote about the camps came out, I heard from the police back in Beijing. I heard from the foreign ministry. They really do go through efforts to make sure that to put all the pressure they can on you and your organization through different avenues to sort of shape the coverage, I think, as best as they can.
Before we take questions, I just want to ask the two of you the same question. Is there any sympathy in the Chinese population for the situation the Uyghurs are facing right now? Is this just a government thing or something
well,
bigger?
It is a good question, and unfortunately, China today and generally China's CCP, Chinese Communist Party, not only an attack targeting to the Uyghurs, even targeting the Chinese, Tibetan Muslim, Chinese Christian, and the Falun Gong, every group in Chinese civilian as well. But unfortunately today we haven't got any sympathy from the Chinese civilian. It is the big issue. So, but however, in outside China and some democratic Chinese movement in outside Europe and the United States, we have some good cooperation with them. They understand our situation, but inside China, we haven't seen really support and solidarity by the Chinese civilian people, unfortunately.
I guess some of the reason for that is the lack of information within China. But how do you, what's your observation there, Adolf, when it comes to the...
Well, unfortunately, I haven't been able to visit China in 11 years, so my observations are a little dated. But I think we have a big problem there, because one thing is Chinese propaganda is becoming more and more sophisticated. You should know about that, both domestically and internationally. So, but even if this is a tricky issue for them, clearly, because it has spread and you have such a big Uyghur and Kazakh and other people living outside China. So I don't really know I'm afraid, and my experience from earlier on is that the Chinese are very happy with the minorities people as long as they can play a role in a more, singing and dancing tradition, more in the cultural, as cultural artifacts in a way. But when it comes to real rights, autonomous rights, or which are enshrined in the constitution, which aren't put into practice, then that's a different thing, because then the minorities are being looked upon as very unthankful, because the Chinese government is supporting, and they are, of course, they're really funneling lots of money into, for their own sake, to develop this, because it's a matter of natural resources. That goes for Tibet, that goes for Xinjiang especially. They're strategically important areas. So the China is doing a lot for these areas, and they're still unthankful. They don't appreciate what we're doing. So it's a little of the same syndrome as we had earlier, or we still have here, when it comes to support to the third world, development support in European countries. There's a little of the same syndrome. And then you also have the very, very deeply ingrained Chinese cultural notion of superiority, which is also the basis for much of the attitude towards the minorities, because they are regarded as kind of children, innocent children who need enlightenment and who need guidance to become culturally Chinese, because that's the definition of what culture is. So it's like in my whole career, I met one Chinese. He was a scholar, he was an enlightened person. I met one single Chinese who said, well, if the Tibetan wants to go, let him go. Whereas all the others, they say, oh, no. But then I must also say that the same scholar said, Taiwan? No, Taiwan cannot go. So this is really, we're also faced with this situation.
Are there some questions from the audience? Yes. I think we have a microphone here for Megha.
Hello. I wonder about censorship inside Xinjiang. To which extent is the censorship there carried out effective, and are there any opportunity to access information coming from outside, from the outside free world?
Is it directed at someone specific, or anyone who wants to?
Anyone. Anyone.
I guess, Megha, you were there last.
Sure, I can take that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, so just in China as a whole, the media environment has become very, very constrained. I think basically since Xi Jinping took over in 2012, it was before then, but it's now gotten to be a lot more constrained. So that is both in kind of what you would call traditional news media, things like newspapers, radio, and TV, as well as on the internet, on social media. So that has kind of a dual effect, I think. So you asked about within Xinjiang. So it's really hard for people to access information there. Kind of independent media sources, even that are publishing the Uighur language, like RFA and stuff. They're all blocked by the internet censorship system. So you can't really access it without a VPN. Elsewhere in China, it might be straightforward for you to get a VPN. Within Xinjiang, it's really not, and that's because basically it's you can really get in serious trouble for using VPN. Another kind of aspect of life in Xinjiang, like sort of everyday life now, has become kind of cell phone scanning, and basically what that is like when you're at a checkpoint, or maybe you're somewhere walking on a street. If you're in a city, you walk into the checkpoint, and if you're a Han Chinese person, you might go straight through. If you're a Uyghur, somebody might stop you. A police officer will take your phone, ask you to open it, and they'll manually scroll through, and they'll look at what apps you have, things like Facebook and Twitter. Like, you're not supposed to have those things. You can get in real trouble for having those things. They might look at your text messages, see what kind of multimedia files you have. So sometimes this happens manually, and sometimes they'll do it with a handheld cell phone scanning machine. So in that kind of environment, there's not a lot of ways to get information. There's not a lot of ways to get around censorship. And like I've known Uyghurs who live abroad that will have gone home to visit their families and they delete those apps from their phone before they go. So people are really conscious of this. So there's another impact of this kind of censorship that I'll talk about, and that's sort of the inverse of that, which is getting information out. So as a journalist in 2018, when we cover these kind of global crises, right? I always use the drug war in the Philippines as an example. That is like a pretty intense human rights crisis that involves extrajudicial killings, and was a big news event, I think, a couple of years ago. And having covered that, I know that in a situation like that, there's lots of sources of information. There's when a killing happens, there's the journalists and photographers, there's the neighbors who are posting photos on Facebook. There's the police report, there's human rights lawyers, there's NGOs, there's kind of all of these little data points through which we, the public, figure out what's happening. In Xinjiang, none of that stuff exists. It's just a black hole because people aren't able to post things on their own. They can't get their stories out through conventional media because conventional media is censored. They can't even text people or call people who live outside the country because people in Xinjiang can get sent away to detention camps just for having contact with the outside world, which is why so many people in this room, as you pointed out, have probably, this is it's not just censorship that enriches all of us and our ability to access information about what's really happening.
Any other questions? There's a hand in the back. Oh, and there's one.
Hi, two questions. First of all, there's been a lot of reports about the use of psychotropic drugs in these camps. And I'm wondering if any of the people on the panel have any insight into that occurrence and if there's been any research on it. Oh, okay. First of all, did you get the first question? On psychotropic drugs in the camps. Secondly, it strikes me that what's happening right now, there's a lot of different levels of internment. And I'm worried that the Chinese state will eventually allow investigations. But what we'll see is just very limited types of internment. So there's people like the professor mentioned, several people have been condemned to death. They're obviously in actual prisons now. There's some people in the re-education camps, but there seems also to be several different levels of those. And then there's people kind of on house arrest who are forced to work in factories adjacent to the camp. So I'm wondering, from an activist point of view, perhaps, Dolkun, maybe you can speak to this. How do you deal with this kind of diversity of internment?
Well, today, and it is very difficult to get the information what is going on in the camp. Not only inside the camp, even outside the camp, because Chinese government turned whole the region as the open air jails, we can say. So it is very difficult, and I already mentioned even my job is 24 hours monitoring what is going on in my homeland. But even today, I don't know what is the situation of my father. My father is 90 years old, guys. Even I have no idea. He is still alive or died. It is 21st century. And from Africa to around the world, this communication is not the issue. But today for the Uyghurs is a big issue. Even I couldn't get any information. I asked this, some requests to the State Department when I have a meeting last summer and the German Foreign Ministry. Okay, I don't want to save my family member. At least please you're trying to get some information. So what is the situation of my family member? Well, what is I'm saying? Because the situation is so terrible, so to be honest, it is really, really difficult to get information. So we don't know what's going on in the camp. But one thing is very clear, it is because sometimes very accidentally Chinese government post on some pictures and accidentally and some people and who was stay in the camp in the past and escape because some of them is foreign citizens. That's why it's released. Now is a few former detainer after release and came out to Kazakhstan, United States, and Turkey speak out their witness. They speak out and what was going on, what kind of torture, what kind of physical torture, what kind of mental torture was faced. They speak out. But we know a couple of numbers, and at least we know 36 death cases was happening in the camps. Some suicide was happening in the camp. And that recently I got one news, it's very strange. And today's family member couldn't get any news, family member in the camp. That's why family members pay to the police, pay to the judge to sentence, to move to the jail. You know? This is today's 21st century, you cannot find any human history. Your family member pays the money and send your children to the jail because environment of the jail much better than the detention centers. Because if you jail and the sentence 5 years, 10 years, at least you know the situation. You can little bit communication ability. But the camp, no definite time, what is the situation, how long you will stay, what is the situation, because environment it is very bad. If it's a very small room, you have to stay 20, 30 people. No space even to sleep in here. And that's why today's family member pays the money and the children and the son and sent to the jail. It's better. It is the sad situation. So that's why we really don't know what is going on in the camp. And we heard also middle of October, Chinese government stopped all the transportation between Øst-Turkestan to China. And we were surprised on what was happening. Then just a couple of days later, we know what does it mean, because after a lot of international pressure, maybe this is one reason, and the transport Uyghur detainer to inner China. It is saying some number, it is 400,000 or 500,000 and Uyghur detained transport to inner China. But what reason? What is this? Which city? And what is this situation? No, we have no idea. So,
Harald?
Can I just add on a little, because I think eventually the Chinese, my guess is that they will allow a guided tour for either diplomats or journalists to visit some of these camps, and
They have actually.
They have actually.
Yeah, already. Yeah,
Yes.
some. Yeah, few.
Okay, but they're probably
no one Western country, just all the Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan,
okay.
this country, yes.
Okay, but I, if you kind of flip back to European press from 1934, after the Nazis took over in Germany, you see the same reports about the happy life in the concentration camps that people had there. So I think we're up for a little of the same stories, but once again I want to stress that I think the aim of the Chinese is more sophisticated, if one could say, than this very way the Nazis solved the issue.
When the reports of these groups of prisoners coming out of Xinjiang and into Indochina, that was happening at the same time as the Norwegian state visit to China, and they were in the neighboring in the Gansu province, so the trains must have been passing straight past the royal Norwegian couple, and that made me want to ask you this question, Harald. Are we complicit in our part of the world for not crying out? We have a big Norwegian state oil fund that invests in companies that are directly involved in the camps, surveillance, things like that. So Norway is making a lot of money on this. We're sending our royal couple to China, selling a lot of salmon and not speaking out. Is that just negligent? That's a difficult word. Are we just ignoring it, or are we complicit?
I think we're complicit, certainly. Because I don't know when and where exactly, but on the whole, we certainly are. And again, I think it's a scandal. You said he mentioned the state visit in last September, October, and it's just hilarious, or actually rather sad, because you had the king visiting Dunhuang, this fantastic, cultural site in Western China, next to Xinjiang, but part of the Silk Road system. And he was quite outspoken, saying that, well, you can only. They was asking, what's your view here? How do you view China? I said, well, there are things going on there, in the next province that's quite worrying. And afterwards he was censored by the Norwegian the foreign minister. And this hasn't come out very clearly in the Norwegian press, but that also shows how much they are tiptoeing in order not to offend the Tsars, the emperor in Beijing.
Yes, she tried to explain what he actually meant. There was a question in here.
Good evening. My question is actually directed in a sense of uncertainty and unknowing. So my question is this. We mentioned again and again China is trying to sinify the Uyghur people, right? Is there an exact definition of what sinifying is, like in regard to what is an ideal Chinese citizen that Uyghur should be? Because there are many people who speak fluent Chinese, they're educated in the Chinese system, they're a law-obedient citizen, and they're all being arrested or sentenced to death or life in prison. So personally, I feel like it's just an excuse saying that, hey, we're trying to sinify them, we're trying to make them being part of the big family as a big flag, but their main intention is something completely different. Can we speak more on this issue? Thank you.
I guess you touched upon this by saying that they prefer them when they're singing and dancing. Is it possible for a non-Han Chinese to become 100% a proper Chinese citizen?
Well, could I do a little historical detour? Do we have room for that 2-3 minutes? Because if you go back towards the end of the empire in 1911, the Chinese Republicans were discussing different ways, how is China going to look? The national revolutionists with Sun Yat-sen, they said, okay, it's the state first and then afterwards the country. We just want to get the managers out. But then they kind of switched and said, hey, countries, should we retain the borders or not? And then the more liberal, the ones who went for a constitutional kingdom, they said, like Liang Qichao, he said, no, we want to keep the borders, that's China, and then we start educating people. So this is actually what the communists are doing today. They are kind of playing on this old idea of a joint Chinese identity. Even the Chiang Kai-shek, the dictator later on with the nationalist, he said that, well, all these people in China, they're actually only different clans of the same people. So that is the background. And that's coming back today, because the Chinese authorities are very well aware of the fact that their minority policy has failed. So what did they do? And they're actually prominent Chinese social scientists have come out and said, let's do away with the whole autonomous system. China today is what you call a multinational unified state. So it's multinational, they acknowledge that there are minorities, but you can't tear the state apart. Unlike in Soviet Russia, which was a federation. That was the legal reason why Russia could dissolve. There's no such way in China, but the policy has failed. So there have been new ideas coming up, being presented by serious, prominent Chinese scholars, saying that let's do away with the whole the autonomy system. It isn't working. It's giving the nationalities possibilities of creating trouble. So let's go for, we're all the same Chinese citizens, and then we allow for certain cultural variations. That's what's on the table today, and that's the way I interpret the assimilation policy that's going on in Xinjiang today as a testing ground for a different state makeup of the Chinese state, no less.
But we also touched upon how the experiment in Xinjiang can be used, the surveillance, the brainwashing, how that can be used in a greater context within China. Did you see signs of this when you were working in China, that it's accelerating this need to control the population and the means with which to do it?
Yeah, you mean like brainwashing kind of thing? Yeah, I mean, in Xinjiang, it's hard to say just because, you know, access is so bad. You can't just, and people don't necessarily tell you their real opinion, right? Like, who's going to tell a journalist that they hate the Communist Party and, you know, they live in a town in Xinjiang? It's just not going to happen, right? They would be putting themselves at risk. So I think it's sort of an open question whether this kind of like re-education or whatever you want to call it is actually effective, or if it's just sort of like rule through fear. But I do think, sort of speaking, you know, in the context of the whole country, the kind of efforts towards message control in academia and in think tanks and in government has been pretty remarkable. And a lot of that is accomplished through a kind of more prosaic means. So for instance, if you're a young scholar at a university and you're sort of seeking promotion, your promotion is going to be tied to things like, you know, how well you do in the context of like Marxist thought, for instance. And, you know, I remember, I think shortly after I started at Reuters, like 2013, 2014, I met an up-and-coming academic at a big think tank in Beijing, and we had a really good conversation, and I was like, hey, like, do you want to exchange phone numbers? He's like, oh, there's a new rule, I'm not allowed to give you my business card because you're a foreigner, but we can swap WeChat accounts, which I thought was very strange. But there's a lot of it's a lot of stuff like that. It's sort of when you disincentivize people from engaging with kind of outside thought, you incentivize them to kind of stick to modes of thought that are sort of accepted by the party leadership. You end up, I mean, I don't know if you would call it brainwashing or not, but you sort of end up promoting one system of thought at exclusion of all others, and I think that effort has been just remarkably successful.
We have time for, I guess, one more question from the audience, if there's a hand.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank each and every one of you just standing there and hold this panel. Because just like Harald said, maybe in the next 5 years, I don't know if you ever can. So thank you so much, because you are the voices of you people today. My question is, we are maybe around 1,500 Uyghur people living in Norway, in exile. We are never arrived in Norway because we are hungry, because we were living in poverty, or etc., etc. We came to Norway just because we are politically persecuted, and all the issues that you mentioned. I was very happy in 2009 because that time our Prime Minister today, Erna Solberg, she actually wrote a blog about Uyghurs, about that unrest which took place in 2009 in Rimchi. And I was sort of hoping for that. She is going to maybe kind of be the front figure of the Norwegian politicians to raise more human rights issue upon Uyghur people and around the world. But what I have seen until now, at least, it's kind of disappointing. But anyway, my question is maybe Megan and maybe Harald. We Uyghurs, many of us have families who are detained in those camps. We sort of try to do our very best to do at least anything. Maybe I don't know why, I don't know what, but just do anything, just try to help them, you know, in certain ways. But I see what we are trying to do is we are trying hard, but certainly not getting more attention from our local government. So I want to hear your opinions, what we as a local Uyghur community here we can do to maybe just push our government a little bit to raise some more attention to our issues, because we are, like you mentioned, even though we are Norwegian citizens today, but we are still getting attacked on social media or on different social communicating apps from the agents in China. How can we do to protect our rights in a better way and to raise more attention to our issues? Thank you.
I guess maybe, oh, wait, you want to start, Harald?
Well, I understand your plight, and it's not easy. I actually remember back when I was called up by Norwegian immigration authorities. That must have been right after the Golia massacre in '97. That's probably in the aftermath of that. The first political refugees started to come, or they came, you know, through third countries or something. And they asked me, "Are these Uyghurs really oppressed?" And I said, "Yeah, they're oppressed, but they manage." So that was my advice. And of course it has become worse and worse last 20 years. So you had a big influx. I remember when Rebia Kadir was in Bergen in 2004. I mean, the whole Folkets Hus, you know, this assembly house in Bergen was filled up with Uyghurs coming from all the coastal areas of Norway. So you are a big community. And I think that's a little of the key, that you should make your voices more heard in the Norwegian society. You should quote Prime Minister Solberg on a blog. Nail it to the cross. Really. So I think this is, it will have a bigger impact than I'm sitting here or going out in the press. We can work for information and you know, what we think is true information, so people know the facts. But you as a group, I think you really have leverage in the whole Western Europe, and certainly also in Norway. When you're, as you said, you're about 1,200 now, and I mean you're safe. Many of you, as you have Norwegian citizenship, but of course you have to be careful because of your families. I know that. So as a group, you have a chance of really achieving something.
How about you, Megha? Have you seen examples with your work with Uyghur exile communities where they're able to reach through and gain traction with their local governments?
Yeah, it's hard. I'm not going to speak specifically to Norway because I just don't have a deep enough understanding. But as an American, I think the Uyghur community there is sort of increasingly being heard. Of course, the U.S. is a different situation because you know, the Trump administration is already kind of at odds with China on a whole range of issues, and this is sort of one of them. So the kind of policy environment is sort of more favorable to you know, taking kind of a stronger stance on the Uyghur issue. I will sort of just mention two things that I've heard from American policymakers that I think are applicable here in Europe as well. One thing that I've heard from you know, policymakers in the U.S. is that you know, people there really respond to personal stories. You know, it's like when you talk about 1 million people in camps, nobody can imagine what 1 million people look like, right? It's very difficult, and you know, we're living in a world right now where there's just you know, it's a very difficult world. Like, you know, there's Syria, Yemen, Myanmar. There are just horrible things happening all over the place. So it's like, how do you sort of make this come up on people's radar? I think you know, a really good way to do that is to show people how it impacts you here in Norway, to show how it impacts you know, Uyghurs who have become naturalized here, who live here, you know, to show that it's not just happening in some sort of faraway corner of the world, but that it's happening to real people that you would meet anywhere, you know, on the street here. I think that's really impactful, you know, especially because policymakers are people too, and a lot of these people care very deeply about human rights, sort of, you know, inside themselves. They want to do the right thing, be good people, but they sort of need a way to connect to the issue, and that's sort of my perspective as a journalist as well. And the second thing I would say is that I guess in my time covering China, there's a sort of mythology out there that the Chinese government is so powerful that they don't really care what anybody thinks of what they do, especially in the arena of human rights. And I actually don't think that that's true. And if you think about other issues, like there was the arrest of the 5 feminists a few years ago, after Samantha Power and lots of other people came out and said this is ridiculous to arrest women that are protesting sexual harassment on buses. They were released. And we saw that again with Liu Xia, the widow of Liu Xiaobo, who was released and is now in Europe. And even on the Uyghur issue, I think after, since the pressure has mounted in the international press and criticism has come from some international governments and from the UN, there have been sort of tentative signs that they're pulling back just a little bit. There was a case recently where, they said, I think it was maybe 20,000, either 10,000 or 20,000 Kazakhs were allowed to emigrate, to go back to Kazakhstan. There are kind of officials that are coming out and saying that the intensity of the campaign may reduce this year. I think the leadership in China is such that they'll never come out and say, you told us to stop doing this, so we're going to stop doing this. It's not going to happen. It's not going to look like that. But I do think that they are very sensitive to the pressure. You can see that in their kind of efforts towards propaganda, and I do think that it's effective to embarrass them and to call on officials here to embarrass them and just make sure that even as time goes by, this stays in the public eye. I think that's really important.
I remember the blog, and I remember her book as well, where she wrote that business interests should never be more important than our core values. But foreign policy is tricky in Norway. It's consensus based, and the current government seems to have the same approach as their predecessors. We're out of time. I just wanted to give you the last word, Dolkun Isa. We know this is difficult for governments to deal with because China is such a powerful country and the business interests are just so great. But if you had, say, the Norwegian Prime Minister in front of you, what would you tell her to have her change Norwegian foreign policy on this issue?
Well, Norway is a democratic country with rule of law, and the democracy, human rights, and the rule of law is a basic value of the Norwegian society. So that's why money is important, yes, of course, but human values is more important than money. So if Norwegian government forget or ignore it and the human rights issue and the humanitarian issue, then this and the Norwegian society, this package is empty, because so that's why I call then the Norwegian Prime Minister, if she's in front of me, I can ask her, please you speak up, and there should be, and today we are talking about not couple of hundred, couple of thousand people's freedom. We talk about millions of people's freedom. And secondly, in Norway, at least 2,000 to 3,000 Uyghurs living here. So Uyghurs who living in Norway, they are taxpayer. Some of them is citizens of Norway, and this Norwegian government has a responsibility to protect them basic right, at least a communication right to the family member. They are taxpayer and they cannot stop to thinking family member every day getting worse bad news from the country. Then this is the in fact this mental problem, not the Uyghur people. I can say all the Uyghur who live in Norway and Germany and the rest of the world, we cannot stop to thinking what's the situation of family members, because we are human beings. So that's why, and the Norwegian Prime Minister should not be silent. And Norwegian government, as I say, it is a democratic country, rule of law, and there is a must responsibility to protect it. It is Uyghur citizen at least, and they should be they speak out and they take some concrete action.
I'd like to thank Raftostiftelsen Foundation, Norsk for organizing this. thank you to all of you for coming, and most of all, thank you to our panel here who've done a fantastic job. Thank you so much.